Hello. Today I want to begin with the first week of teaching material by looking at critical thinking for effective learning. And I'll begin by looking at some of the things that we're seeking to do in this first of our weekly lessons. Firstly, we're going to focus on how people think, that is, the approach to thinking, rather than the content that you'll find in each of your subjects, whether it be maths, science, English, humanities, physical education, or a number of different subjects. Secondly, we'll be looking at how we engage with other people who think differently to us, including a secular world, which may doubt our Christian faith, or people from other backgrounds who may question our Christian faith, particularly when it comes to bringing our faith to teaching and education. And we can look at some of the reasons why we value faith in our students for a wider sense of learning that goes beyond the content material. Thirdly, we want to help people to learn to think in order that they might become more effective learners. Also, we want to reflect on our own approach to thinking. Where do our ideas about thinking come from? Who's influenced us, whether it be our parents, our culture, our immediate surroundings, or whether it go back further hundreds of years to the origins of the modern world in which we live, or the last 2,000 years, whether it be a Christian worldview or other worldviews that have developed over many centuries. We want to reflect on our own assumptions and understanding in order to develop a deeper understanding of the nature of truth. Then, as well as this, we want to understand the nature of critical thinking and how it can be applied and outworked in order to make the students that we're working with and teaching better thinkers. Help them to appreciate skills in thinking, but also skills in relationship, skills in self-evaluation, skills that they can apply to their many different subjects to do well. We want to appreciate various forms of knowledge, whether it be the more scientific knowledge or the more humanities-oriented knowledge, music or visual arts, drama, a number of different types of knowledge, and appreciate the ways knowledge is received and formed and passed on to others. And we can look at the advantages and disadvantages of different ways of knowing, whether they be more experiential ways of knowing, more logical ways of knowing, more relational ways of knowing, more tradition-based ways of knowing. They all have strengths and limitations. And we also want to look at the overall connection between the many different forms of knowledge. At times, you may feel challenged, confused by the different positions that are being placed before you. And I encourage you to consider that there are different levels of knowing that we'll be engaging with in this subject. Some could be quite deep. If you want to philosophize and dig deeply into the meaning of knowledge, how we know about God and how we know anything at all, let me encourage you, there is opportunity to do that in this subject. Or if you would rather look at practical, basic ways of knowing, simple answers to basic questions and passing that on to the students, that too is very valuable and needed. Let's learn to value one another. Some who are wanting to get more abstract and complex in their thinking, some who are wanting a more basic level of thinking, and some who are more interested in one subject area or another subject area. They were challenged and confused by one another and the different ways of thinking at times. And sometimes we may even feel offended or disagree with approaches to thinking. It's necessary for us to be challenged at times in order to think more deeply, to raise questions about the assumptions that we make and what we believe and why we believe. We'll also have opportunity to reflect on aspects of Christian faith if you're from a Christian tradition, and to look at that which is solid and unmovable in our faith. And we'll encourage you to be committed to those core faith decisions that you make, but at the same time to humbly consider some of the reasons why they are held in order to be able to communicate these truths to others. We want you to understand that the intention is not that you become upset or confused, but rather that you think more deeply about the issues that are being addressed. And as a teacher, you're going to encounter students who will question or doubt or think differently. And so when you come across students who are cynical and question what you say, it's important that you develop ways of communicating to them. It's important to be confident in who you are so that you're not thrown off track by students who question what you say. Your confidence is going to give the students confidence as they challenge ideas and thoughts around them. So my provocation, our provocation, is that one of the greatest challenges in Christian education is to equip young people with arguments, not arguments for argument's sake, but arguments based on sound evidence needed to understand and articulate a defense of the Christian faith. This is called apologetics. In a world that at times can be hostile because people are wanting to go their own way rather than to follow the Christian way. And if you want to read more about this, I encourage you to read Steve McAlpine's article on Christian, Are You Ready for the Exile Stage 2, where he argues that there is a sense in which Christians sometimes feel as though they're exiled from the center of society by those who resist society. And just as in the Old Testament, the people leaving Egypt towards the promised land under Moses, and then the people who were in exile in Babylon after the attack of the Babylonians, people like Daniel who remain faithful to truth. Christians too can at times feel they are challenged to remain faithful to truth at these times. At times, we'll see that there is a tension and overlap between the modern way of looking at the world, the scientific way of looking at the world that focuses on the empirical, that which can be observed and measured, and the material and scientific ways of looking at the immediate present, the facts that correspond to reality. And there's an overlap there between that knowledge and that which the Bible reveals as God's process in working in this world through the Old and New Testament. And in weeks to come, we're going to look at the Greek view of the world in the second week, and then the Christian view of the world in the third week, and then we'll move on and look at the ways in which views of the world developed through the last 2,000 years with Augustine and Aquinas and Martin Luther through to the Enlightenment period and the modern era in which we live. And we'll look at different views of truth at different times in history. We'll look at different views of truth amongst different groups of people. We'll look at the evidence that people provide, and then we'll address questions about the world we live in, the modern world today, as to asking the question, are these views of the world truly true when they're based on a focus on economics or based on a focus on the material? What about bigger questions of relationship and love and hope and meaning that we find in people's lives? We see that this is not the first time that Christians and believers in God have had to face a challenging world around. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 4 and 17, we see 4 young men who read the books and became well educated in the wisdom of their time, and they rose to positions of prominence, but they also faced challenge from the times in which they lived. And in the book of Acts, we read, following on Jesus being challenged by the religion and Roman politics of his time, and God raises him from the dead, and the Christian message spreads more widely through the power of the Spirit. We see there in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, again, a reminder that there is a presence of God and a presence of truth amidst of the challenges that are being faced. In 2 Timothy 3:16, the Apostle Paul writes that Scripture, the Bible, can speak into these times. It's God-breathed and it's useful to encourage people with teaching on what is wise and right and true, in rebuking people when they follow their own human inclinations, in correcting people when they go wrong, and in training people in righteousness. 2 Timothy 3:16. We'll look at the ways in which Scripture can be interpreted soundly and the way in which scripture can also be misinterpreted at times. But this is just one area of knowledge, epistemology, what we know and how we know. As people who live in this world, we also need to consider axiology, ethics, value and worth and relationships. And we also need to consider answers to the big questions of existence, which is often called metaphysics. And so in seeking to answer these questions and much more, we can develop an apologetics or a reasoned defense of our belief and a reasoned defense of reasons we look to scripture as answers to what we believe. So as we look at effective learning through creative problem solving, reflection and discernment, service and learning in service learning, and the ability to articulate and defend beliefs and truth, we could engage with epistemology and knowledge, value and worth, metaphysics and answers to the big questions. We could engage as Christians with what the scripture says in speaking in apologetics to these big questions, and we could begin to apply these insights more broadly to specific subjects like the physical sciences and maths and history, or like ethics and creative arts and humanities, and also into various other fields of knowledge, including religious knowledge or aesthetic knowledge or art and music, and in indigenous areas of knowledge. We can see that we use a number of different ways of knowing to engage with these different fields of knowledge, whether they be maths and science on the one hand, or humanities and arts and poetry and music and literature on the other. At times we're focused more with our sense perception on the physical sciences, but sense perception comes up to more in the humanities. At times we're focused in using the way of knowing through intuition in the humanities. We have a sense in poetry about what we know, but intuition can also be important in the physical sciences and mathematics. At times we bring reasoning to our understanding of the humanities, or reasoning to our understanding of the physical sciences. At times we bring language into the humanities, but also language is important in the physical sciences. And so there's an overlap of the fields of knowledge and the ways of knowing. And during this course, we're going to ask you to think about the different ways you know, and we're going to encourage you not to just focus on one way of knowing, the senses alone, the five senses, or intuition or experience alone, or logical reasoning alone, or emotional response alone. We're going to encourage you that if we believe in God, God has given you all of these different ways of knowing, and the challenge is to integrate them and to recognize that students are using all of these different ways of knowing in their capacity to know and to reflect in their knowledge and in the ways in which they know. So you can find a copy of this diagram in the resources section on Moodle, and I encourage you to reflect on the different ways of knowing and also on the different fields of knowledge in which they're applied to. And in the Australian curriculum, you'll find guidelines to the different fields of knowledge, maths and science, and history and humanities, and you'll also find reference to different ways of knowing, and we'll study both of those in greater depth in this subject over the weeks to come. So critical thinking methodology involves a number of strategies, and I encourage you in the next few weeks to think about what are the strategies that you use, how could they be more fully developed and well organized, and what are the strategies that you could teach your students to use more fully and more effectively. Critical thinking methodologies involve a number of steps, and you could come up with your own system of 4 or 5 or more of these, and you could think through what order to put them in. And I encourage you, if you've got time, to write down some of the different strategies and methodologies you use when you're thinking. Here's one list. Firstly, critical thinking doesn't just look at what to think. So if you're doing work on a motor car, it's not just about what is to go together in the motor car, but how does the motor car operate? How do I understand how the motor car operates? It's how to think is a bigger question than just simply what to think. Facts are important, but beyond facts, there is understanding and understanding of how we think. So critical thinking is about different ways of thinking. Secondly, we need to understand the advantages and different disadvantages of different ways of knowing. That is, some people rely on their senses, and there's real strength in that. But what about memories of yesterday? What about hopes for the future? What about that which can't be seen yet? An architect who's designing something, a musician who's putting together a song, beyond their senses, they may use intuition. So there's strengths and weaknesses into intuition. People may respond and people may say, I have a hunch that this is right or not right. Or are we better to use measurement? Our argument in this course is that both are important. Some may respond with emotions and others may try and avoid emotions. Some may respond with imagination and others try and avoid or challenge imagination. There's a place for all of these ways of knowing and thinking. And in this course, we're going to think about the advantages and disadvantages of different ways of knowing. We're also going to think about truth and what do we mean by truth? Is truth facts? Is truth more than that? It includes attitudes and attitudes of love and a heart of love. What's it mean to be fully human, to understand truth? How does truth relate to what it means to be human? We're going to look at various fields of knowledge, maths, science, humanities, and we're going to look at how skills in critical thinking can be useful in each of these and how you can impart that to your students. And then we're going to be learning through explaining to others how we put these insights into practice. So I encourage you in the weeks ahead to take some time to think about how you think, and take some time now to think about what are the steps you take in order to think well. How do you dig more deeply into the questions that are asked of life in this world? Questions that are asked about faith, questions that are asked about education. What steps do you take? What resources have you found to be useful in gaining greater understanding and knowledge? How useful is it to rely on other people, and what sorts of other people do we rely on? What literatures do you go to, and how do you test whether these are reliable literatures and sources? What web-based sources do you rely on, and how do you check that they're reliable? And what frameworks for thinking and what views of the world do you find central to your understanding of what is true and right and that which is not so true and right? And where do your ideas about what is true and right and how to think and how to view the world come from? We all put on glasses, worldview glasses, which we use to see the world around us. Where do these worldview glasses come from? What cultural conceptions do you have? In the second assignment, we'll ask you to think more deeply and fully about your worldview, your approach to thinking, and where it comes from and how it can be developed more fully, and how you can grow in understanding. So that's the introduction to this first part of week one. After a break, we'll come back and we'll have a look at the second part of this first week presentation, where we're going to look at our assumptions, our preconceptions, our preconceived ideas, and how we often see and understand things not as they are, but we've got to use language, models, and ideas to describe them. We see and understand things as we are, as our culture asks us to see and shapes us to see, and our language shapes us to see. I'll see you shortly after the break.